May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Gook Audio podcast, Tassajara Stories. I'm DC Poobah of Gook Audio and Gook Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free from economic hardship and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So we've got 3 pieces from the work in progress Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki, and we're going to get right into them as soon as we have had our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, hit pause if you wish, and meditate or whatever for as long as you wish, and when you're ready to come back, hit unpause. And we'll hit the bell to end the meditation and barge right into the first of the Tassajara Stories for today. The new kitchen was finally opened in 1970. A wonderful building, Paul's masterpiece, with unreinforced, thick stone walls and Nils's joinery and the contribution of many zinnis and non, an edifice that still serves Tassajara well. Students may enter the side door at any time to get something to eat from the small but well-supplied snack area there. But in the early years, only the coffee and tea area was available. The practice was to eat what was served when it was served. Sometimes that did not seem to be enough. Some of us would get physically weak and dizzy and go to a stash we had in our room or to the kitchen to beg for mercy, which might work depending on which kitchen worker was begged to. Or sneak into the storeroom for a gob of peanut butter, an apple, or some crackers. One day I was so crazed, I drank a whole can of evaporated milk. Another day I was so compulsively crazed, I drank 2 cans of evaporated milk. That was too much. It made me crash. I remember Paul couldn't get over that. He'd look at me and shake his head going, 2 cans of evaporated milk. Not just me. Some of us would stagger into the kitchen and announce we were going to faint if we couldn't put something into our stomachs. Some people thought we should get treatment for hypoglycemia. Yvonne called it being a boy. If Tommy was working in the kitchen, he'd help out. But if he was standing next to a certain Tenzo, head cook, it would be her call. One time a young guy went in and said he really had to have something to eat right away. Aforementioned Tenzo said to him, "No, it's bad for your practice." "You're not saying that because it's bad for his practice," Tommy said. "You're saying no because you like to say no." The problem was not only people coming in from outside the kitchen. People inside the kitchen had stomachs too, and there was a strict policy of not munching while preparing meals. That policy worked at times and broke down badly at times. If one took a nibble other than the customary sample for taste, another might. And if the head cook did so, or whoever was in charge, the dam could burst and everyone would be washed away. I've seen it become a compulsive habit like tobacco addiction, where people couldn't stop even when they didn't want to eat more. I haven't seen this type of behavior in recent decades. We were finding our way back then. It was brought up in an officers' meeting that food was being taken at night from the kitchen and kitchen storeroom. Tatsugami said, "Lock the doors." The officers argued with him. "We can't lock the doors. That's not our way," etc. But Tatsugami couldn't understand why not and said, "Put locks on the doors instead of your minds." Stanley was the treasurer and buyer. He got hold of Joel, whom Silas had shared warehouse space with. Stan used to do books for Silas. Joel imported locks, so he sent down a couple with a set of keys for each. The kitchen and storeroom then sported spiffy imported locks, and keys were given to a few kitchen staff and officers. Founding Tassajara Tenzo, Ed Brown, now in the garden, thought it was terrible, though he'd get angry about people stealing food. When Suzuki heard of it, he didn't think it was so great either, but he was in the city and didn't interfere. Almost no one liked this solution, and some were angry. Peter did not enjoy announcing it in the Zendo. Maybe Nils, Bob, and I were principal, but not the only culprits as far as food pilfering at Tassajara went. Some combination of us would sit up talking till late, the only ones awake in the whole place. We'd only do that on a night before a day off, when we'd get up an hour later at 4:45 in the morning. That happened on days with a 4 or 9 in them, 4 and 9 days. In practice period, that meant there'd be just one zazen, a briefer service, orioke breakfast in the Zendo, the whole day free till evening service and special dinner in the dining room. So if we were tired, we could nap during the day. Sometimes we'd walk down to the baths in the quiet blackness. There wasn't a bath watch then. And we'd get hungry and go to the kitchen in the cold dark. We'd get inside and light the kerosene lamp. No need to fumble in the dark for matches. Only need, remember the dictum, where there's an altar, there's a match. Keep it low so as not to put a telltale bright glow in the window. Then we'd see what we could find. Sometimes we'd cook eggs and make toast with butter and jam, or cheese sandwiches, and sit down to eat at the kitchen table in the center of the room. We'd clean and put stuff back as we went along, wash our dishes, and leave without a trace. We didn't take food that would make the kitchen noticeably short of anything or screw up a planned meal. One night in the unlocked days, Nils and I went in, and the big pot on the Wolf stovetop, waiting to be heated early the next morning, beckoned. Nils removed the lid. "It's gruel. Let's eat the gruel," he enthused. He stuck his hand in it and brought some to his mouth. I objected, told him that's gross, and got bowls and spoons. He was into it, though, acting like a starving madman, making grunting noises. I walked over to the oven, but before I could dish up, Nils yelled out in surprise, God damn, you fucking crazy!" I turned to see what was that all about. In the dark corner, sitting full lotus on the grill top, was Ed Brown staring at us with a large meat cleaver in his lap. Nils yelled at him some more with his customary cursing. Ed continued to sit there quietly as Nils tried to engage him. I quickly recovered the pot, put our unused bowls and spoons back in place, and grabbed Nils for our mind-blown and embarrassed retreat. One might think that would be enough to discourage such raids, but those of us with criminal minds merely learn from the mistakes of the past and thus hone our deviousness. During one practice period with Tatsugami, a small group, for a time, staged a rather brazen departure from the scheduled norm. About 6 of us would miss the day off oryoki breakfast in the Zendo to cook and eat a meal together in Ken Sawyer's Volkswagen bus, which was parked down below the lower barn, well away from the central area. I also recall Jerry Fuller, Tim Aston, Larry Hansen, Diane Goldschlag. Surely not always the same people, as someone might have a responsibility in the kitchen or Zendo at the time. We'd slip out of the Zendo after Zazen before the briefer day-off morning service and saunter, not as a group, down Tassajara Lane. Attendance was only taken for Zazen. Surely it was obvious there were fewer than usual in the Zendo, but it was a day off, and so surveillance mentality was not on high alert. The night before, 2 of us, in rotating responsibility, would have entered the kitchen late to borrow the required foodstuff for pancakes and scrambled eggs. Leaving the sliding door of the vehicle open, we'd cook, eat, drink, yak it up, and return again, not as a group, to enjoy the rest of the day off. We're sitting up late in Diane's dorm room, the one nearest the creek. There was a blanket over the window so the fire watch couldn't see a kerosene lamp still lit the room. They were determined to circumvent Tatsugami's lock on the kitchen door. Were waiting for everyone to be asleep so that they could take a ladder to the backside above the creek and enter the kitchen through the window. Just as they were about to leave, Diane looked out to make sure the courtyard was clear and saw a light from a flashlight moving on the other side of the kitchen. Someone with a ladder was beating them to it. They went down and looked into the kitchen and saw Craig climbing in the creek side window, and then watched as he carefully made himself a meal, and then as he put the prepared food in serving bowls and carried them on a tray into the Zendo. Craig was Jikido, Zendo cleaner, who sleeps there the night before the day to clean. He had his oryoki already set on the meal board in front of his zafu. He slowly walked down the aisle with the serving bowls held high and placed them on the floor in front of his seat, and then he took his seat, first properly bowing toward the zafu, then away, arranged his robe, put his hands in gasho, and started chanting the meal chant, opening his bowls in the proper way and serving himself. He did the whole ritual, finished eating, then cleaned his empty bowls with his cloth-tipped, tongue depressor-shaped setsu. He had not prepared the next 2 steps of the ritual, though. At that point, hot water is brought in by servers. Then a brief chant accompanies the buckets for the wash water to be dumped into and for that water to be offered in the garden. However, Margaret came down the aisle at that point with the hot water kettle and bowed to him, as is the custom. At first he froze, and then held up his large bowl with both hands to receive the hot water. When he'd finished washing the bowls, Diane came in with the bucket while she and Margaret chanted, "The water with which we wash these bowls tastes like ambrosia." He kept following the form and chanted along, "We offer it to the various spirits to satisfy them. Om Kurasai Svaha." He emptied the water, now in his small bowl, saving a little for the customary final sip. Diane bowed with him, walked out, and quickly watered a plant outside. He dried his bowls, tied them up in the wrapping cloth, finished the meal chant, placed his oryoki in its place in the wall, fluffed his zafu, and got up to return the serving bowls. Diane and Margaret hid and waited for him to go to sleep, and then went into the kitchen to make their snack. And in the process of doing so, Diane dropped a gallon jar of honey. It broke, and she got honey all over her clothes and the floor. She was cleaning up long into the cold winter night. Diane and Margaret never discussed that clandestine meal with a twist with Greg afterwards. The most difficult part of the whole affair, she said, was having to contain themselves to keep from laughing. A few days later, someone stole the locks. Peter brought it up at a group meeting and with trembling voice said he'd learned a lot from this experience. The locks were not replaced. Jane. Jane Runk, not yet Schneider, was riding into Tassajara with Suzuki. He was impressed that she'd taken an intensive course in Chinese where they had to learn 60 Chinese characters a day. He asked her what else she'd studied. She said astrology, as did Bill Lane, who had arrived at Zen Center with her. She started talking about what she'd learned from it and how she'd applied it to her life. I expounded on it for 10 minutes, and he didn't say a word, and finally he looked at me and said, "You look so serious when you talk." Driving along Chews Ridge, they get out to look at the view, both wearing zori. Suzuki came up to Jane's shoulder. As they were getting into the car, he asked her, "Do I remind you of your father?" "No, not in the least little bit." "Really?" "No, my father's real tall. He's 6'4". "Oh, you mean that difference." Jane found that studying with Suzuki was not like studying Chinese or astrology or anything else she'd ever studied. She'd listened to his lectures, and while I sat there, I thought I understood everything he was saying, and when I came out, I couldn't remember a word he'd said. I'd go see him, and when I'd come out, I'd understand more than I could account for. She felt a warmth coming from him and an expansiveness, but didn't quite see what he'd done or she'd done to bring this about. She recalls he was relating every moment with complete openness, and he'd relate to our big part, not the part that was asleep. He was awake, front and back. He saw the part that was asleep and the part that was awake. It seemed to her he didn't have any particular teaching, more a method. She didn't know quite how to define it. He had a way, but for everyone it was different. All he tried to do was wake us up. If you were this way, he was that way. And if you were that way, he was this way. If you came to him resentful, he was this way. And if you came to him giddy, he was that way. Suzuki greatly admired Huining, the celebrated sixth patriarch of Chinese Chan or Zen. When Huining was dying, he gathered his disciples together and told them to use the same method Jane had described Suzuki using. Huining said that there are many pairs of opposites, and whatever your students come to you with will express a side of one of those pairs. And what you do then is to respond to them with the other side. Huining and Suzuki would bat the dualism and discrimination away, or, as Suzuki would at times call it, sticking to an idea, like astrology. Freezer. Most people around the Zen Center didn't drink much to begin with. In the city, that would tend to be a Saturday night, and at Tassajara, it had to be a town trip. And then my observation was that almost everyone wanted ice cream. I can remember people going to an ice cream shop and me to a bar across the street to get a double shot of Irish whiskey. Some people at Tassajara would at first crave soft drinks, especially Coca-Cola. People would come in saying they didn't know how they'd do without meat. But I never saw any of that matter for long. Ice cream was what would still be on their minds after all this was forgotten. We had no freezer. Silas had gotten rid of a bulky rectangular one right off when we got the place. Used too much electricity, and frozen stuff wasn't on the monastic or guest menu. There was another freezer that was stored in the lower barn, a square one. A few of us were cleaning that building out of stuff to go to Goodwill or the dump in town. We'd load the pickup there and drive it up to in front of the Zendo to unload in the larger six-ton Dodge and then go back. The last item was the freezer. There were 4 of us, and it was heavy. We figured 500 pounds. We got it as far as behind the pickup when the bell to end work and get ready to go to noon service rang. I said, okay, let's get this up there so I can get going over the mountain right away after lunch. No one would do it. They said we could finish this at the beginning of afternoon work, and we need 2 more guys. I said, no, we can do it, but they said no, and anyway, I could leave then with enough time to do what I needed to do. So they all walked off and left me standing there alone. The pickup bed was about 3 feet high. I scratched my head. And then Nels walked up. David Chadwick, what are you doing? Well, I wanted to get this freezer up there on the truck, but everyone stopped when the bell rang. Well, why don't you load it? He said in a more profane manner. Gee, Nels, sure, and then I'll move the mountain. You could do it by yourself. You don't need anybody. You just need leverage. I'd do it for you and let you watch, but I'd rather follow the schedule. And he walked off. I found I could fairly easily tilt the freezer. Did so and pushed a brick under the raised side. Rocked it another direction and slipped a board under it. Just kept doing that sort of thing and got it higher and higher till it was even with the bed and pushed it in right side, left side, right side, left side. Drove it up to the Dodge, which had a flat bed about a foot higher and applied the same technique. Parked the pickup by the shop and was standing on the bed of the Dodge next to the freezer when everyone walked out of lunch, waved to my fellow students who had deserted me, got some nods and a wave back, like they didn't see anything unusual. Nils walked up and I proudly told him how I'd done it and how quickly I'd done it. He berated me for being so slow. Another moment of glory fizzled.